The stars were dying above the Valhallan skies. Once they burned with the fierce clarity of 1,000 banners unfurled across the void, but now their light flickered like the last embers in a hearth abandoned for centuries. The galaxy was heavy with silence, a silence born not of peace but of exhaustion, of wars that had stretched across millennia until even the heavens seemed wearied of their endless cycle. In that silence lay ruin, and in that ruin lay Valhalla, the ice world that had stood for generations as a symbol of the Imperium's endurance. Now it shivered on the edge of extinction, snowfields stretching into infinity, broken only by the shadows of fortresses carved into permafrost and the skeletal shapes of rusting war machines half buried in the drifts. It was here that the last stand of a people began, and it was here that one man carried the weight of both his world and his soul. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. General Curion stood upon the battlements of the Valhallan capital fortress, his eyes fixed on the horizon where a red glow bled into the snowstorm. His breath rose in pale clouds that vanished into the frozen night, each exhalation as fleeting as the lives he commanded. Behind him, the walls groaned with the weight of history, their stones scarred by bombardments centuries old. Before him stretched the endless tundra, and upon that tundra marched death itself, a force so vast and so relentless, it seemed less an army than an elemental tide. Yet it was not fear that bound Curion's thoughts, but doubt, a poison far colder than the snow beneath his boots. He had fought all his life for the Imperium, given every victory and every scar to the dream of a throne he had never seen, a god he had never touched. And now, as the night drew down, he wondered whether the loyalty that had defined his existence had been nothing more than chains fastened around his heart. The wind howled, a low dirge that spoke of frozen graves and forgotten names. It carried with it the taste of ash, bitter on his tongue, and in the distance he could hear the muffled roar of collapsing outposts. Reports had arrived earlier, delivered by soldiers with frost clinging to their lashes and blood frozen on their coats. The line had broken. Villages burned, trenches collapsed, and the enemy's war machines advanced inexorably, their silhouettes black against the storm. Curion closed his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw visions not of strategy, but of faces. Men and women he had commanded, comrades who had died nameless in the snow, and his daughter, Lyra, whose laughter had once filled the fortress with warmth before war smothered it into silence. The Empire demanded obedience, the people demanded protection, and his own heart demanded truth. But truth was dangerous, and truth was betrayal. A voice cut through the storm behind him. "General!" It was Commissar Elira, her posture as rigid as the sword at her side, her words clipped by discipline sharpened into cruelty. "The scouts report movement in the east. The enemy pushes faster than expected. We must prepare executions for deserters. Fear cannot be allowed to spread." Her eyes, dark as obsidian, held no reflection of doubt. To her, loyalty was a fire that consumed hesitation, and she would see it burn through every soldier's heart, no matter the cost. Before Curion could reply, another figure emerged from the shadows of the wall, Sergeant Myros, his oldest comrade. His voice was hoarse from smoke and shouting, but his words carried the weight of compassion, sharpened by despair. "General, the men are breaking. They know the Imperium won't send help. You see it. I see it. Valhalla has been abandoned. We can't kill them for knowing the truth. We have to give them something worth dying for, not just orders scrawled from a throne that's never seen our sky." The two voices clashed like steel in the air, and between them stood Curian, his silence heavier than either argument. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, where the red glow pulsed brighter, as though the planet itself bled into the snow. His mind churned with memories, of his oath sworn as a young officer, of banners raised high above battlefields that were now only graves, of promises whispered into Lyra's hair when she was still small enough to sleep without nightmares. Duty or truth, loyalty or love. The war outside mirrored the war within, and both pressed against him with crushing inevitability. Below the battlements, the fortress was restless. Soldiers trudged through drifts with hollow eyes, their breath rattling through frozen masks. Civilians huddled in chambers carved into ice, clutching rosaries, photographs, fragments of lives already lost. Fires burned low, casting shadows that danced like wraiths across the walls. Each moment felt stretched, elongated by dread, as though time itself conspired to prolong their suffering. Curian descended into those corridors, his boots striking against stone that trembled faintly with distant artillery. Whispers followed him, some reverent, some resentful. To many, he was the last hope of Valhalla. To others, he was merely another general leading them to slaughter. Both truths felt heavier than the armor on his shoulders. In the command chamber, maps lay scattered across a frost-stained table. Red markers denoted the enemy's advance, and there were too many of them. Each marker was a wound upon the land, a reminder of failure. Curian pressed a hand against the table, the cold biting into his palm as though punishing him for daring to believe he could change anything. He traced the line of defense, jagged and fractured, and saw that it was no longer a line, but a graveyard waiting to be filled. Around him, officers muttered strategies, spoke of reserves, suggested sacrifices. Their words blurred into a chorus of futility, drowned beneath the echo of his own thoughts. We were never meant to survive this. We were meant to be forgotten. One more shield shattered to protect a throne too distant to hear our cries. Yet even in despair, a fire smouldered. Curian lifted his head, and his eyes caught the gaze of every officer in the chamber. He did not speak of victory, for victory was a lie. He did not speak of salvation, for salvation was a myth. Instead, he spoke of memory. We are Valhallans. We were born in ice, and we will die in ice. But let it be said that when the storm came, we did not kneel. Let it be remembered that we stood, and that our defiance froze eternal in the snow. His voice was steady, low, and it carried through the chamber like a blade through silence. For a moment, even despair itself seemed to pause. When the officers dispersed, Curian remained alone. He stared at the map until the lines blurred into emptiness, and then he looked beyond it, to the walls around him, to the fortress, to the people. He felt the weight of every heartbeat depending on him. Above, the storm raged on, and beyond it, the stars flickered, dying one by one. He knew, with a clarity sharper than ice, that the days ahead would break them all. Yet still he clenched his fists, still he stood, because the fall of Valhalla would not begin with surrender. And so the night deepened, heavy with unspoken oaths and the promise of blood. In the distance, the enemy roared, and the snow carried their echo into the heart of the fortress. The war had already begun. The morning after the council was a dawn without light. The storm had not lifted, but thickened, smothering the land in a haze of swirling ash and snow, until horizon and sky became one grey shroud. The fortress walls groaned against the wind, their old stones cracking faintly, as though they too longed to collapse into the white abyss. General Curian walked among his soldiers as they prepared the outer defences, his heavy coat drawn tight, frost clinging to his beard. They looked at him with eyes dulled by exhaustion. some with faith, others with quiet accusation, but all with the knowledge that what awaited them would not be survival, but remembrance. The trenches stretched outward like wounds carved into the ice, filled with figures hunched against the cold. Laser guns clutched as if warmth might be coaxed from their iron frames. Kurian moved slowly, speaking little. His presence alone meant to be an anchor. Sergeant Myros followed close behind, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of frostbitten armor. His voice lowered so only Kurian could hear. "They know, General. They can see the supply lines are gone. They whisper that High Command has left us to bleed. They're right, and you know it." His breath came ragged, curling into the storm before vanishing. "If you keep feeding them lies of reinforcement, you'll lose them faster than to any enemy gun." Kurian did not answer. He kept his eyes on the trench line, watching a young soldier's hands tremble as he tried to adjust the charge pack of his weapon. The boy could not have been older than 20, his cheeks hollow from hunger, his eyes burning with a fear that discipline could not quench. Kurian knelt beside him, steadying the shaking hands with his own gloved grip. "Breathe slow," he said, his voice low, steady as the grind of ice across stone. "The storm is your ally. Let it guide your aim. Trust in the man beside you, for he will die for you as you will for him." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, and the trembling eased, though his gaze lingered on Kurian as though clinging to a father he had never known. When they left the trench, Myros spoke again, his tone bitter. "You give them faith, but not truth. How many more must you comfort with promises you don't believe?" Kurian's silence was his only reply, but in that silence was torment. He could feel Myros's eyes searching him, demanding something he could not give. Truth would break the last threads of loyalty holding the regiment together. Lies would rot them from within. Either path was death. At the gatehouse, Commissar Elira stood watching the snow-swept plains with her usual severity. Her black greatcoat snapped in the wind like a banner of judgment, her hands clasped behind her back. When Kurian approached, her gaze cut to him, sharp as a blade. "The men grow restless," she said flatly. "Rumors spread that the Imperium has forsaken us. I will stamp it out before it spreads further. Execution squads are prepared." Her words fell into the air with the weight of inevitability. Myros spat into the snow, fury flashing in his eyes. "That's what you call loyalty? Butchering the last sons of Valhalla to keep your doctrine pure?" Elira's lip curled, her composure cracking with disdain. "Doctrine is all that keeps this fortress standing. Men die, worlds fall, but obedience is eternal." Kurian raised a hand before the quarrel could sharpen into violence. His gaze held both of them, two pillars pulling him in opposite directions. Elira's fire was ruthless, yet her certainty was armor. Myros's compassion was fierce, but it threatened to unravel discipline with every word. Between them, Kurian felt himself fracture further, a man torn between two truths that could not coexist. They were interrupted by the sound of horns echoing across the wind. A squad of scouts stumbled through the gates, their coats shredded, their bodies bent by frost and exhaustion. One collapsed outright, snow crusting his lashes, blood staining his chest where lass fire had scorched through armor. The leader, his voice ragged with cold, gasped out words that cut through the fortress like a blade. The eastern outposts, gone. Not a survivor. The enemy marches in phalanxes, endless lines of steel and fire. They will be here within days. Silence fell heavy. The soldiers who had gathered listened with hollow faces, as though hearing the tolling of their own funeral bell. Kurian felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken question burning in their eyes. Will you lead us to life or to death? He gave no immediate answer. He helped lift the fallen scout onto a stretcher, his gloved hand pressing briefly against the dying man's shoulder. The eyes that met his were clouded with frost and despair, but still searching for reassurance. Curian whispered, "You will be remembered." It was all he could offer, and he hated himself for how little it was. That night, the fortress smoldered with restless voices. Fires burned in courtyards, their light flickering across faces gaunt and haunted. Myros sat beside Curian near one of the flames, the crackle of burning wood their only company for long moments. "They won't hold if they think this is for nothing," Myros said quietly. "Tell them the truth, that we are abandoned. Let them fight for Valhalla itself, not for a throne that forgets our names." His words carried a plea, but also a challenge. Curian stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He thought of his daughter, Lyra, still tending to the wounded in the makeshift infirmary. He thought of the soldiers who had looked to him as a symbol, not a man. He thought of the snowbound graves stretching across the tundra, row after row of frozen bodies still gripping their rifles. His jaw tightened. "If I tell them the truth, it will break them," he murmured. "If I give them lies, it will poison them. What do you ask of me, Myros? To choose which death we suffer?" Before Myros could reply, the fortress bells rang, deep and sonorous, echoing through the frozen air. A runner burst into the courtyard, breathless, his voice cracking with urgency. "General, to the north walls. You must see this." They followed him into the howling wind, ascending the battlements where soldiers huddled in disbelief. The storm had thinned for a moment, and through the veil of snow they saw it. A line of fire stretching across the horizon, torches and engines, the march of an army so vast it seemed to consume the earth itself. The glow reflected off the ice, turning the white tundra crimson, as though the world itself bled. The men murmured, fear thick in their voices. Elira's hand rested on her holster, eyes blazing as she barked for silence. Myros stood at Curian's side, silent now, waiting, and Curian, staring at the advancing tide, felt the cold seep into his bones, heavier than any winter he had endured. He closed his eyes, just for a heartbeat, and in the darkness behind them, he saw again that cracking ice, the dream that haunted him. The ground was giving way beneath his feet. When he opened them, the enemy's fire was brighter still, advancing without end, and the night seemed to whisper the same word into every ear: doom. The fires on the horizon did not fade with the dawn. If anything, the red glow thickened, staining the sky until it seemed as though Valhalla itself burned beneath an unseen sun. The fortress was restless, its walls vibrating faintly with every distant bombardment. Soldiers moved like shades through the courtyards, their voices hushed, their faces gaunt. Snow drifted down in pale veils, but instead of cleansing, it seemed to bury them deeper into silence. General Curian stood in the command chamber once more, his hands pressed against the frost-streaked table, where maps lay spread like open wounds. Every marker told the same truth. The enemy's advance was inevitable. The only question that remained was how long Valhalla could delay the inevitable collapse. A sound broke the chamber's tension, a grinding of iron at the gates, followed by the muffled bark of guards. Curian turned sharply as the doors swung open. A new detachment stumbled into the room, their uniforms tattered, banners broken, armor scoured by fire. They were Valhallan, but not his own. Their leader, a colonel with one eye clouded and his left arm bound tightly with frozen bandages, saluted weakly before slumping against the wall. Behind him shuffled barely 36 men, the last remnants of a regiment once 1,000 strong. Their eyes were hollow pits, yet in those pits burned a fragile, defiant light. The colonel's voice rasped like stone dragged across ice. "Reinforcements, General, from the northern fronts. What's left of us." The words hung in the air, both gift and curse. They had not come to save Valhalla, only to die with it. Curian studied them in silence, reading their bodies the way he read terrain. Boots worn through, rifles scavenged from the fallen, frostbite gnawing at fingertips. They were men already, half dead. And yet they had come. Something like pride stirred in him, but it was bitter, laced with sorrow. Sergeant Myros broke the silence, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Reinforcements? This is mockery. 30 men, no supplies, no artillery. Command sent them not to hold the line, but to burn with us." His words carried the sharp sting of truth, and murmurs rippled through the officers clustered around the table. Commissar Elira's eyes narrowed, her tone cutting. "They are soldiers of the Imperium. That they arrived at all is proof of loyalty. Better 30 faithful than none. Discipline, Myros, not despair." The colonel gave a grim smile, exposing blood-stained teeth. "Discipline! My regiment marched through hellfire and betrayal to reach you. Supply lines were severed. Orders changed with every day, until we realized no one intended for us to survive. We are here because the enemy gave us no other path. Call it loyalty if you must. Call it desperation if you dare. Either way, we will stand with you until the end." His words were not shouted, but they struck like a hammer against fragile glass. Elira's lips tightened, but she did not reply. Curian stepped forward, laying a hand on the colonel's shoulder. "You will have your place on the line," he said. "You are Valhallans still, and Valhalla does not die quietly." The men raised their chins at that, though exhaustion clung to them like frost. He gave them no promises of survival. He gave them remembrance, the only currency left. Later, as darkness fell once more, the fortress fires burned higher to fend off the storm. In the mess hall, soldiers crowded together, the air heavy with smoke and unspoken dread. The newcomers spoke in low tones, telling stories of burning towns, of comrades turned to ash by artillery blasts, of orders that sent men into the jaws of death without reason. Their words spread quickly, poisoning what little faith remained. Myros sat at Curian's side, his face grim. "You see, even they know. The Imperium abandoned us. Every tale they tell is proof. Will you still ask them to die for a throne that sent them to slaughter?" Curian said nothing. His gaze drifted to the shadows in the corners of the hall, where young soldiers leaned closer to catch every whispered word. Doubt was a contagion more lethal than any shell. Yet to silence it would be to shatter trust entirely. He felt the storm gnawing at his command, tearing at the thin threads of faith that held the regiment together. That night, in the infirmary, he found his daughter tending the wounded. Lyra's hands were red with frostbite, yet steady as she bound the stump of a soldier's arm. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sickly sweet scent of burned flesh. Curian stood in the doorway, watching her work, unable to step forward. She glanced up at him once, her eyes full of something sharper than anger, deeper than sorrow. "You still tell them help will come," she whispered, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "They know it's a lie. I know it's a lie. Do you think me blind, Father? Do you think I can't see the death that waits for us all?" Her words pierced deeper than any accusation Myros or Elira had hurled. He had no answer for her, only the silence of a man already condemned by his own heart. In the small hours, sleep eluded him. He stood once more on the battlements, the storm stinging his face, the horizon still glowing with the enemy's advance. The red fire pulsed like a wound, closer now, each flicker marking the shortening of their time. A runner approached through the snow, his voice raw with cold. "General, dispatch from High Command. Urgent." Curian broke the seal with numb fingers. The parchment crackled, words etched in the clipped tone of distant authority. "Hold Valhalla to the last man. Reinforcements redirected. Glory in sacrifice. The Emperor remembers." He read it twice, the words dissolving into ash beneath his gaze. No promise of aid, no plan of salvation. Only death, sanctified and sealed. For a moment, the weight of the message pressed so heavily against him, he thought it might drive him to his knees. He closed his eyes, and in that darkness he saw the faces of his soldiers, the trembling boy in the trench, the half-dead colonel, his daughter's silent fury. He felt the chains of loyalty digging deep, dragging him down into the abyss of obedience. Betrayal coiled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. When he opened his eyes again, the storm had thickened. Snow swirled like ash in a funeral pyre, and the horizon burned brighter, closer. The bells of the fortress tolled once more, low and sonorous, echoing through the night, as if the planet itself mourned. Curian held the dispatch tightly, the parchment crumbling beneath his grip. In the sound of those bells, he heard the truth as clearly as a voice whispered in his ear. Valhalla was not meant to survive. It was meant to be erased. He turned from the battlements, his face carved of stone, his silence heavier than the storm. The order burned in his coat pocket, a betrayal carried close to his heart. Tomorrow he would lead his men into a battle already lost. And tomorrow he would decide whether he was still the Emperor's general or only Valhalla's ghost. The bells still echoed in the marrow of the fortress when the morning rose, bleak and dim. The storm had eased, but left behind a suffocating stillness, as if the very air had been drained of sound. Snow lay deep across the battlements, masking scars from the bombardments, though nothing could hide the jagged cracks in the walls or the hollow stares of the soldiers who manned them. General Curian stood alone in the courtyard, the High Command's order still folded in his coat pocket, its weight pressing against his chest like a stone. He had not shown it to anyone, not to Myros, not to Elira, not even to his daughter. The words burned, yet he held them in silence, knowing that to reveal them would unleash despair far swifter than the enemy's advance. The men gathered in knots, speaking in whispers that drifted through the cold air. Rumors moved like smoke, of outposts destroyed, of reinforcements diverted, of betrayal cloaked in the language of duty. Curian heard them all without responding. The truth he carried made their whispered fears seem almost merciful. He felt the weight of every glance that sought reassurance, every murmur that demanded clarity. His silence became a wound, but he could not open it without bleeding them all dry. Sergeant Myros found him near the gates, his expression hard, jaw clenched against the cold and the unspoken rage that simmered within him. "The men need to hear from you, General," he said, his voice low but sharp as ice. "They're clinging to scraps of hope, and scraps won't hold them much longer. If you know something, if you carry words from command, you must speak them. Better a bitter truth than a sweet lie that shatters in the first bombardment." Before Curian could answer, Elira appeared, her boots striking the frozen stones like hammers. Her greatcoat snapped in the wind, her presence sharp, unyielding. "The soldiers do not need truth," she said, her voice carrying with iron certainty. "Truth breeds weakness. They need only loyalty. Hope is not our weapon. Obedience is." Those who falter must be reminded that the Emperor remembers sacrifice, not doubt. Fear is purged with fire, not with sentiment. Her hand brushed the hilt of her pistol as if to underline her creed. The two of them faced each other, Myros with compassion burning into defiance, Elira with severity sharpened into threat. And between them stood Curian, silent, torn, his heart divided by chains and echoes. He looked from one to the other and saw the war within himself reflected in their eyes. Myros demanded love, Elira demanded obedience, and both paths seemed to end in ruin. That evening, Curian gathered the officers in the command chamber, the air heavy with frost and fatigue. Maps still spread across the table, though their lines of defense had become nothing more than lines of graves yet to be dug. The colonel who had brought the tattered remnants of reinforcements leaned against the wall, his face gaunt, his bandaged arm trembling with every shallow breath. "The men are whispering of mutiny," he said quietly, his voice carrying the rasp of frostbite in his lungs. "Not against you, General, against the Emperor. They speak of Valhalla's life, not his glory. If you cannot hold their loyalty to the throne, then perhaps you must hold their loyalty to you." His words fell like a stone into water, rippling through the chamber. Elira's eyes narrowed into slits, but Myros's expression softened, almost hopeful. Curian said nothing. Instead, he unfurled the latest reports from the scouts. Charred villages, dead civilians frozen where they fell, enemy banners planted in the snow like black teeth. Each report was a dirge, and together they formed a requiem for a world still dying. He laid them before the officers and let the silence stretch. None could look long without flinching. When at last he spoke, his voice was a low growl, heavy with exhaustion. "The enemy will be upon us within days. Reinforcements will not come. We hold with what we have. We hold until we cannot. And when we fall standing." The words were bleak, but they ignited something in the room. A grim resolve, not hope, but the cold defiance of men who had no illusions left. Elira nodded sharply, as if the steel in his voice confirmed her creed. Myros's eyes, though, searched deeper, looking for a crack, a promise that Curian had not given. Later, when the officers dispersed, Curian lingered. He unfolded the parchment in the solitude of the chamber, reading the command once more. "Glory in sacrifice." The Emperor remembers. He felt bile rise in his throat. Glory was ash. Memory was silence. He crushed the parchment in his fist until it cracked, then thrust it into the brazier. The flames licked at the edges, devouring the words until nothing remained but smoke curling into the rafters. For a moment, he felt a hollow relief, as though erasing the command might erase the betrayal. But the ash clung to his gloves, black smears that no fire could cleanse. In the dead of night, he walked the corridors of the fortress. The walls were damp with melted frost, the air heavy with the smell of oil and sweat. He passed barracks where men slept fitfully, their breaths shallow, their faces gaunt. He passed the infirmary, where Lyra sat by the bedside of the wounded, her head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. He paused at the doorway, watching her, his chest tight. She had grown into something stronger than he had ever imagined, forged not by his protection, but by the cruelty of the galaxy. Yet in her bowed head, he saw not only strength, but despair. He longed to speak, to tell her the truth, but the words froze in his throat. He turned away before she looked up, retreating once more into silence. On the battlements, the night was merciless. The sky was a black moor streaked with faint stars, their light feeble against the storm. And there, across the horizon, the enemy's glow pulsed ever nearer, an unbroken line of fire crawling across the tundra. Curian gripped the frozen stone, the frost biting through his gloves. He imagined the line advancing until it swallowed the fortress whole, until all that remained was silence and snow. He thought of the oath he had sworn, of the throne that had abandoned him, of the people who still looked to him as the last shield between them and annihilation. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness he heard voices, his soldiers murmuring their doubts, Myros pleading for truth, Elira demanding obedience, Lyra whispering prayers in a room heavy with blood. The voices tangled, indistinguishable, until they merged into one overwhelming question. Who did he serve? The emperor who had forgotten Valhalla, or the people who would die at his side? The wind howled, carrying with it the distant thunder of engines. The enemy was closer. The storm would not hold them long. Curian's eyes opened to the horizon, and in that burning line of fire, he saw the reflection of his own heart, caught between chains and freedom, between betrayal and sacrifice. His silence had preserved them thus far, but silence would not hold the walls forever. Soon he would have to choose, and that choice would carve his name into either loyalty or treachery. The snow thickened again, veiling the horizon. The glow flickered through it, crimson threads against the grey. Curian did not move. He stood unmoving on the wall, a figure carved of frost and sorrow, as if waiting for judgment to descend. And beneath his breath, though no one heard, he whispered words meant only for the storm. If they have abandoned us, then let me learn what it means to be free. The fortress breathed with unease, its walls echoing with whispers that grew louder as the enemy's glow bled nearer across the tundra. Snow had stopped falling, but the air was heavy, dense, with the anticipation of ruin. Every man and woman within those walls carried the same knowledge in their silence. Time was narrowing. The storm of steel would soon break upon them, and no one beyond Valhalla's frozen horizon would come to save them. In that silence, cracks began to spread, not in stone, but in faith. General Curian walked among his soldiers in the lower barracks, his boots striking the stone floor in measured rhythm. He passed faces pale with frostbite, eyes sunken from hunger, hands that trembled not from cold, but from dread. He spoke little, nodding where he must, meeting the gazes of men who searched him for an anchor. To many, his silence was a promise, that he carried some hidden assurance, a plan that would shield them. To others, it was proof of the betrayal they already suspected. He felt their eyes cling to him, and each look tore at him like claws. Myros intercepted him near the supply depot, his broad frame casting a shadow in the dim firelight. "We can't hold much longer like this," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Rations are nearly gone, ammunition thinner than the ice beneath our boots. The men need more than words. They need something to believe in, something to fight for besides orders, written by men who have already forgotten us." His eyes, raw with fatigue, searched Curian's face for agreement. "You have to tell them the truth, General. If you keep them chained to false promises, you'll lose them before the first shell lands." Before Curian could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. Elira approached, her boots clicking hard against the stone, her presence radiating severity like frost. "The truth will break them," she said, her tone sharp as a blade. "Hope, however false, keeps them upright. Discipline will hold the line, not sentimental weakness. Speak of abandonment, and you invite mutiny. Speak of loyalty, and you inspire sacrifice." Her hand brushed her pistol as though her argument were already loaded, ready to be enforced by fire. The two voices clashed again, as they always did. Myros with his plea for honesty, Elira with her demand for obedience. Curian stood between them, the storm of their convictions tearing at him as surely as the storm outside. He wanted to shout, to silence them both, to confess the order that still burned in his memory. Hold until death, glory in sacrifice. But he remained silent, knowing that once spoken, such words would crack the last frail bond tethering his men to purpose. That evening, he called a gathering in the fortress courtyard. The snow reflected the torchlight, casting the assembly in hues of blood and fire. Soldiers crowded together, their breath rising in white plumes, their faces drawn. The remnants of the northern regiment stood at the fore, their colonel leaning heavily on his bandaged arm, his one good eye glinting with the brittle defiance of the damned. Curian looked upon them all, his throat tight with the weight of words he could not give. He spoke of Valhalla, of their forefathers who had endured centuries of ice and famine, who had carved fortresses into the frozen earth and stood unyielding against enemies countless and merciless. He told them they were not merely soldiers of the Imperium, but sons and daughters of a world that had never bowed, that had never broken. He promised no reinforcements, no salvation, only that their defiance would echo beyond death. His words did not lift spirits, but they did something more dangerous. They ignited a spark of grim pride, a determination to endure not for the throne, but for the soil beneath their feet. He saw it in their eyes, a shift, subtle but real. Loyalty was beginning to turn from distant masters to the land itself and to him. After the gathering, Myros walked with him in the shadowed halls, his voice hushed but fierce. That was truth enough, he said. Not the truth of orders or promises, but the truth of who we are. That is what will keep them fighting. Elira, however, found him later, her fury veiled but sharp. You walk a dangerous line, General. You speak of Valhalla as if it stands apart from the Emperor's will. Be careful that your defiance does not become rebellion. In the days that followed, preparations for the siege deepened. Trenches were widened, weapons oiled, fuel caches positioned to burn the land should it fall. Civilians were pressed into service, carrying ammunition, fortifying walls, tending the wounded. The fortress became a hive of desperation, every corner echoing with the clang of iron, the scrape of stone, the whispers of men who knew they were fortifying, not for victory, but for memory. Curian walked among them tirelessly, his silence both shield and burden. At night, when the fortress quieted, he found himself drawn to the infirmary. There, Lyra moved among the wounded, with steady hands and weary eyes. She did not look at him when he entered, only continued binding a soldier's mangled leg, her lips pressed in a thin line. When at last she spoke, her voice was soft, almost broken. You tell them we fight for Valhalla. But what of me? What of those who cannot lift rifles, who only bleed and wait? She looked at him then, her gaze piercing. Do we die for memory, Father? Or do we die because the Imperium has forgotten us? He reached for words, but found none. He only touched her shoulder lightly before turning away, his silence heavier than any lie. Her eyes followed him as he left, and he knew she saw the truth he could not speak aloud. On the third night, the horizon blazed brighter. Scouts reported columns of war machines grinding through the tundra, their engines shaking the earth, their torches staining the snow crimson. The enemy was near enough now that their shadows danced against the storm. The fortress bells tolled again, not as warning, but as dirge. Soldiers gathered on the walls, staring into the distance, watching the red tide advance. Some whispered prayers, others curses. Myros stood grim at Curian's side, while Elira stalked the battlements, pistol in hand, eyes sharp for any sign of wavering will. Curian's heart pounded as he watched the glow swell, devouring the horizon. He thought of the order burned in the brazier, its ash still clinging to his gloves. He thought of his daughter's question, of Myros's plea, of Elira's threat. He thought of the men and women who would follow him into fire, their last breaths spent in loyalty or in defiance, depending on the path he chose. The wind carried the sound of engines, low and terrible, like drums of judgment echoing across the tundra. The snow shivered beneath their boots as though the land itself recoiled. The enemy was close now, close enough that the fire of their march painted the clouds above in scarlet and gold. Curian gripped the frozen stone of the wall, his jaw clenched. The storm within him had no resolution, only choices that led to graves. But even in that storm, one truth solidified. Valhalla would not fall quietly. Whether as loyal martyrs or as rebels unremembered, they would make the snow itself burn with their defiance. The soldiers waited, breathless, eyes fixed on him. And though he said nothing, though his silence pressed upon them like the weight of ice, they saw it in his stance, in the fire of his gaze. When the end came, they would not kneel. The first breach came at dawn, when the sky above Valhalla split with fire. The enemy's artillery screamed across the tundra, tearing through the storm and shattering the frozen silence into thunder. Shells fell like meteors, gouging craters into snow and stone, sending shards of ice flying like shrapnel. The fortress walls shook under the bombardment, their ancient stones groaning as if they might collapse into the abyss below. Men clutched their weapons tighter, their breaths ragged, eyes wide with the knowledge that this was no mere probing assault, but the beginning of annihilation. General Curian stood on the battlements, his cloak snapping in the gale, his jaw set like carved ice. He watched the horizon as fire bloomed across it, columns of black smoke rising into the sky. The enemy's lines advanced steadily, a tide of steel and shadow that blotted out the dawn. He gave no rousing speech, no shouted orders. His silence itself became command, and his presence alone steadied the trembling ranks at his side. When the first wave of shells fell short, exploding in the snowfield before the trenches, he raised his hand, and the Valhallans opened fire. Lass fire cracked through the storm, searing lines of red into the advancing dark. Heavy bolters roared, shaking the walls with each thunderous shot. The enemy faltered under the barrage, but their advance did not stop. They came in phalanxes, armored and relentless, their silhouettes black against the flames. For every one that fell, another stepped over the body and pressed forward. Snow churned beneath their boots, stained with blood and ash. Curian's voice cut through the chaos at last, deep and steady. Hold the line. Nothing more, nothing less. It carried across the battlements, through the trenches, into the hearts of soldiers who had nothing left but obedience. They braced, teeth clenched, firing into the tide until barrels glowed red and the smell of scorched flesh thickened the air. The enemy struck the trenches first, their war machines crashing through the snow like beasts of iron. Explosions tore through the lines, sending men screaming into the air. Curian descended from the wall, his boots striking stone as he marched into the heart of the defense. Myros was already there, rallying the men with curses and shouts, dragging the wounded back with one hand while firing his rifle with the other. Elira moved with ruthless precision, executing deserters on the spot, her pistol shots sharp against the thunder. Their voices rose in conflict, even amidst the storm. Myros crying for the men to hold for Valhalla, Elira for the Emperor's glory. Between them, Curian moved like a shadow, his silence binding them both, A blast ripped the trench wall apart, snow and stone raining down. Curian pulled a soldier free from the rubble, his hands slick with blood, his heart pounding. He looked into the young man's face, pale and wide-eyed, and forced the rifle back into his grip. "Stand," he commanded, and the soldier, shaking, obeyed. Around them, chaos raged. The enemy poured into the breaches, steel clashing against steel, bayonets stabbing through the storm. The Valhallans fought with grim fury, their blades flashing, their voices raw with defiance. For a moment, the tide threatened to overwhelm them. The first trench was lost, bodies strewn across the snow, their blood freezing into black ice. But then the fuel reserves buried beneath the earth were detonated, a wave of fire sweeping across the no-man's land. Flames roared into the storm, consuming both friend and foe, turning the battlefield into an inferno. The heat seared the skin of those who lived, but it forced the enemy to stagger, their advance broken for precious minutes. Curian stood at the edge of the blaze, the firelight painting his face in hues of gold and crimson. The screams of the dying filled the air, mingling with the crackle of burning fuel. He felt the weight of it press into his chest, every death another stone upon his soul. Yet he did not falter. He raised his sword, its edge gleaming in the firelight, and the men around him straightened, their voices rising in ragged cries. "Valhalla!" they shouted over and over, until the word itself seemed to shake the storm. The enemy regrouped quickly, their silhouettes returning through the flames. More war machines advanced, their engines grinding, their weapons spitting fire. The fortress shook again under the bombardment, stones cracking, towers crumbling into ruin. Civilians screamed in the lower halls as ceilings collapsed, smoke choking the corridors. Lyra worked in the infirmary without pause, binding wounds as the walls shuddered around her, her hands slick with blood that could not be washed clean. She heard the thunder of war above and whispered prayers that fell unheard into the noise. As the second wave struck, Curian ordered the retreat to the inner defences. Men fell back through the trenches, firing as they went, their boots slipping in blood and ash. The wounded were dragged along, screaming, begging, or silent. Myros fought at the rear, his rifle spitting fire, his face grim with rage. Elira executed another man who turned to flee, her pistol shot echoing across the chaos. Their eyes met briefly. Myros is burning with hatred, Elira's cold with certainty. Curian saw it but gave no judgment. There was no room for justice in a war already lost. The retreat became a slaughter, the enemy pressing harder, their numbers endless. The fortress gates groaned as men slammed them shut, iron screeching against iron. Explosions battered the walls, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Smoke choked the air, thick and acrid, mingling with the stench of burned flesh. In the chaos, Curian felt the last threads of his loyalty to the Imperium snapping, one by one, until only one truth remained. They were not fighting for the Emperor, nor for the distant throne that had abandoned them. They were fighting for Valhalla itself, for the memory of a people who would not bow even as they burned. When at last the gates held, for a brief moment, silence fell. The storm howled, the fires smouldered, the wounded moaned. Curian stood in the courtyard, his sword dripping blood, his breath ragged. He looked around him at the faces of his men, hollow with exhaustion, yet still burning with the cold fire of defiance. He saw Myros watching him, waiting for truth. He saw Elira watching him, waiting for obedience. He saw Lyra carried from the infirmary by stretcher-bearers, her hands still stained red, her eyes searching for him in the crowd. And he realized then that the true battle was no longer against the tide of steel at their gates. The true battle was within him, and within every soldier who still drew breath. To whom did they give their last strength? To a throne that remembered only sacrifice? Or to Valhalla, the frozen land that had borne them, that now demanded their blood? The enemy roared beyond the gates, their engines grinding louder, their torches flaring against the storm. The next assault would come soon. Curian tightened his grip on his sword, the firelight flickering across his face, and whispered words no one could hear. We will not kneel. Not to them. Not to anyone. The fortress shuddered again as the bombardment resumed and the night dissolved into fire. The fortress did not sleep that night. Smoke drifted through the corridor, stinging eyes and throats, while the distant thunder of artillery never ceased. The wounded groaned in the infirmary, their voices weaving through the darkness like the lament of a dying world. Outside, the storm clawed at the walls, driving snow against stone with a sound like whispering claws. Between each bombardment there was silence, and in that silence fear thrived. Soldiers lay awake in their bunks, staring at the ceiling as though they might see through stone to the fiery horizon beyond. They whispered among themselves, voices low and sharp, asking questions none could answer. Why had command abandoned them? Why had the Emperor's hand withdrawn? And beneath those questions lay another, more dangerous one. Were they still bound to loyalty or free to turn it aside? Curian walked the halls like a spectre, his boots striking slow against the stone, his silence heavier than any order. He heard the whispers, but did not rebuke them. He knew doubt had grown too strong to be stamped out. Instead, he listened, and with every word overheard, every murmur of betrayal or despair, he felt the chain of the Imperium weaken in his chest. It did not break, not yet, but the links groaned with strain. Miros found him near the lower gates, where the wind howled through cracks in the stone. The sergeant's face was pale with exhaustion, his beard thick with frost, but his eyes still burned. They're close to breaking, General, he said softly. They believe themselves abandoned, and they're right. You know it. You've always known it. If you tell them otherwise, you'll lose them. His hand tightened on his rifle, as though he might crush it. We must fight for Valhalla now, not for a throne that sent us here to die. Before Curian could answer, footsteps echoed in the darkness. Elira emerged, her black coat billowing, her pistol holstered, but her presence sharp enough to draw blood. Careful what you whisper in the dark, Sergeant, she said coldly. Treason grows quickly, in shadows. These men and women are sworn to the Emperor, and if they falter, they will die as examples, not as martyrs. She turned to Curian, her eyes like blades. You know the truth, General. Their faith must be sharpened, not blunted. Fear will hold them if loyalty does not. The storm outside boomed with artillery, shaking dust from the ceiling. The three of them stood in the echoing silence that followed, the air crackling with tension. Myros's fists clenched, his voice thick with fury. Fear will make them deserters. Truth will make them fighters. The Emperor is not here. He never was. Only Valhalla is. Elira's hand drifted toward her pistol, not in haste, but in warning, her lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. And if the general sides with your poison, Sergeant, then you too may find yourself remembered as a corpse in the snow. Curian lifted a hand, not in command, but in weariness. Enough. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like frostbite. Both fell silent, though their eyes still burned. He turned from them, harm without another word, and walked deeper into the fortress. He could feel their gazes on his back, the pleading of Myros, the threat of Elira, and he carried both like chains upon his shoulders. Later, he stood alone in the chapel, a chamber carved into the ice centuries ago. Its walls were bare, save for the faint carvings of ancient saints whose faces had been worn smooth by frost. Candles flickered weakly in the cold air, their flames small against the weight of the dark. Curian sank to one knee, his sword resting before him. He did not pray. The words of prayer had long since turned to ash in his throat. Instead, he listened to the silence, and in that silence, he thought he heard voices. The voices of his soldiers crying out for truth, the voices of high command demanding obedience, and beneath them, a whisper older than both, the voice of the land itself, of Valhalla's frozen soil calling for blood to sanctify it. He bowed his head, and in the flickering light, his shadow stretched across the floor, like a figure bent beneath unbearable weight. The following day, the fortress walls shook again. Scouts returned with reports of enemy columns massing in greater numbers, preparing for a second assault. Their war machines had not faltered with the first wave's loss. If anything, the fire burned brighter, hungrier. The enemy had time, resources, endless numbers. Valhalla had only the ice, the snow, and the dwindling resolve of its defenders. Curian stood before his officers, the scouts' words still hanging in the air. None spoke, none dared. At last, he said, "Prepare the inner defences. The storm is coming again." That night, whispers turned to arguments. In the barracks, men shouted at each other, some calling for faith in the emperor, others cursing his name. Fists struck, blood spilled, discipline frayed. Myros tried to calm them, shouting over the noise, but his words reached only those who already followed him. Elira stormed into the chaos, her pistol raised, her voice thunder. She executed one man on the spot, the crack of her weapon silencing the room in an instant. "Discipline," she snarled, "or we fall to ruin before the enemy ever reaches us." Her eyes swept the barracks, daring defiance. The silence that followed was thick, poisonous. Curian arrived moments later, his expression carved from stone. He looked at the blood on the floor, at the faces that flickered between fear and fury, and felt the fracture widening. Loyalty no longer bound them as one. Some looked to him as the last voice of the Imperium. Others saw him as Valhalla's shield, a man who might sever their chains. Both truths burned in their eyes, and he knew that whichever path he chose, half would follow and half would curse him. When the crowd dispersed, Myros confronted him outside, his face shadowed, his voice low but fierce. "If you do not choose soon, General, you will lose them all. They need a leader, not a ghost." Elira's voice followed, sharp as ice. "Choose, yes, choose loyalty. Choose the Emperor. Anything else is treason." Their words pressed against him from both sides, blades against his throat. Curian said nothing. He turned away, his silence heavier than steel, his heart screaming in the prison of his chest. That night, he walked again to the battlements. The horizon still burned, the enemy's glow swelling brighter, closer. Snow drifted against his boots, whispering across the stone. He closed his eyes and heard it again. The cracking of ice beneath his feet, the dream that haunted him. He stood above a frozen river, the ground splitting, water roaring below. He was falling, always falling, and in that fall, he saw the faces of his men, of Myros, of Elira, of Lyra. He woke from the vision, standing in the storm, the horizon aflame. The breach would come again. The choice could no longer wait. And still, he remained silent. The night of fire began with silence. No shell screamed, no engine roared. Only the wind whispered across the battlements, carrying the scent of ash and the metallic sting of frozen blood. The soldiers waited, their rifles clenched, eyes darting to the horizon where the red glow pulsed brighter than the stars. The enemy had paused after their first assault, regrouping, gathering their strength. That pause weighed heavier than the bombardments, for silence promised not mercy but devastation yet to come. General Curian stood above the courtyard, his face carved into shadow, his eyes locked upon the line of fire. His silence had become the rhythm of the fortress, his restraint a shield against despair. Yet within him, the storm raged louder than the winds. The chain to the Imperium pulled at him still, whispering that obedience was survival, that loyalty was glory. But another voice, older and colder, whispered that Valhalla itself was his only duty, the frozen soil beneath his boots demanding his blood and the blood of his men. Both truths fought within him, and each hour that passed without decision tore deeper into his soul. When the bombardment came, it fell without warning. The first shell ripped through the northern wall, shattering stone and flesh in a single thunderclap. Fire blossomed across the battlements, lighting the storm in hues of crimson. The enemy roared into motion, engines grinding, machines of iron and flame advancing with relentless precision. Soldiers scrambled into position, their shouts drowned in the roar of artillery. The fortress shook as if the earth itself rebelled against the assault. Curian descended from the wall into the trenches, his cloak snapping, his sword drawn. "Hold!" he commanded, his voice low but carrying through the chaos. The men rallied at the sound, their lasguns spitting red light into the advancing dark. The ground trembled beneath the weight of war machines, the air filled with fire and smoke. Snow turned black, churned into mud and blood as the enemy poured forward. Myros fought at Curian's side, his rifle blazing, his face streaked with grime and frost. "They'll break through, General," he shouted over the thunder. "We need to fall back to the inner barricades before we're slaughtered here." Curian did not answer at once, his eyes fixed on the blaze of the battlefield. Elira's voice cut through from the rear, sharp and cold. "No retreat. We stand here. The Emperor demands it." Her pistol barked, cutting down a soldier who staggered back in terror. Her ruthlessness silenced some, but others flinched, rage and despair thickening the air around them. The trench wall erupted under another blast, snow and stone raining down. Curian dragged a fallen man clear, thrusting a rifle into his hands, forcing him upright. "Stand," he growled, and the soldier obeyed, though his legs trembled. Around them the enemy surged closer, bayonets flashing, war cries mingling with the screams of the dying. For every foe slain, two more pressed forward, their shadows endless against the storm. When the second trench line faltered, Curian made the choice. He raised his sword high, its edge gleaming in the firelight. "Fall back to the barricades!" His voice thundered above the chaos, carrying through the storm. Myros nodded, relief flashing in his eyes, while Elira's face twisted with fury. "Retreat is betrayal," she spat, but her protests were drowned in the roar of the men pulling back, dragging the wounded, firing over their shoulders as the enemy poured into the ruined trench. The retreat was madness. Flames swallowed the snow, and bodies fell with every step. The screams of the wounded rose into the storm, some dragged to safety, others left behind to vanish beneath the tide. Curian fought at the rear, his sword cleaving through steel and flesh, his presence a wall that gave the retreat shape. Myros shouted orders, rallying men into lines even as they stumbled over the dead. Elira shot deserters as they fled, her face stone, her eyes cold. Her pistol cracked, silencing cries of terror. But each shot seemed to drive the men further from her command and closer to Curian's shadow. They reached the inner barricades, hastily built walls of stone and iron reinforced with fuel drums and sandbags. The men threw themselves behind them, reloading weapons with trembling hands. The enemy pressed close, shells tearing the night, engines grinding. And then, with a roar that drowned all else, Curian gave the order. Ignite the reserves. A wave of fire swept across the battlefield. The buried caches of fuel erupted, flames racing through the snow like rivers of light. The inferno consumed friend and foe alike, a wall of fire that burned so hot it seared the storm itself. The screams were endless, high and raw, a chorus of agony carried on the wind. Soldiers shielded their faces, their eyes wide at the fury of the blaze. The night became day, painted in red and gold, as if Valhalla itself had been set alight. Curian stood before the flames, his sword in hand, the fire reflecting in his eyes. For a moment, the enemy faltered, their advance broken by the inferno. The line held, but at what cost? Charred bodies lay scattered, Valhallan and foe alike, their flesh blackened, their faces unrecognizable. Myros staggered to his side, his voice raw. We bought time, nothing more. The men are breaking, General. They fight for you, not the Emperor. You saw it in their eyes. His words were desperate, a plea buried in truth. Elira approached, her coat scorched, her pistol still smoking. Her voice was iron, unyielding. And yet you speak of retreat, of weakness. They will fight for loyalty. If they falter, fear will drive them forward. The Emperor remembers sacrifice. Her eyes bored into Curian's, sharp as a blade. But if you speak as Myros does, you will drag them into treason, and I will not hesitate to act. The fire crackled, roaring between them. Curian said nothing, his silence once more the only answer. He turned his eyes back to the horizon, where beyond the blaze, the enemy's glow still pulsed, endless, undying. Even fire could not halt them forever. Later, in the quiet after the flames had dimmed, Curian walked the corridors of the fortress. He passed soldiers huddled in shadows, their eyes hollow, their whispers darker than before. He passed the infirmary, where Lyra worked tirelessly, her hands raw, her face pale. She looked up as he entered, her eyes sharp, demanding, "How many more, Father? How many more will you burn to buy a moment?" Her voice trembled with fury and sorrow both. "You cannot save them. Not by fire. Not by silence." Curian's throat tightened, but he could not answer. He touched her shoulder lightly, then turned away. Her gaze followed him, piercing, accusing, as though she saw the fracture in his soul clearer than he did. On the battlements, the storm returned, thick snow veiling the world. The fire still smoldered in the distance, but beyond it, the enemy marched on. Their glow burned through the storm, red and eternal. Curian gripped the stone, his breath clouding before him. He whispered into the snow, words that vanished as soon as they left his lips. Not for the Emperor, not for the throne, for Valhalla. And though no one heard him, the storm seemed to carry his words into the night, scattering them like ashes across the endless ice. The firestorm that had scorched the snowfields dwindled into embers by the next night, leaving only a blackened wasteland where the first lines of defense had once stood. The wind carried the smell of burned flesh through the corridors of the fortress, clinging to every breath, seeping into every corner. Men whispered that even the land itself had turned against them, that Valhalla was devouring its children along with the enemy. The walls no longer echoed with the defiance of the first days. Now they carried silence, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the coughs of the wounded and the distant thunder of enemy engines pressing closer. Curian moved among the barracks, his boots crunching over stone dust shaken loose from bombardments. Eyes followed him in the shadows, hollow eyes that had lost the shine of faith, but clung still to his presence as if he alone tethered them to survival. He felt their unspoken questions like knives against his back. Would he speak of hope? Would he admit the betrayal? Would he lead them for Valhalla or for the Emperor? His silence stretched, and in that silence the questions grew teeth. Myros cornered him in the corridor outside the armory, his face lined deeper than the frost could carve, his voice low but seething. "The men know," he said. "They've seen your eyes, General. You don't believe in the Emperor's salvation any more than they do. Stop clinging to chains that cut your flesh. Give the word. Tell them this fight is ours alone, and they'll bleed for you, not for a throne that abandoned them." His hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury restrained too long. If you leave them in this silence, they'll turn on each other before the enemy even reaches the gates. Before Curian could answer, the echo of heels struck stone. Elira emerged from the shadows, her greatcoat swirling, her gaze like the edge of a blade. "Careful, Sergeant," she said, her voice calm but deadly. "Your tongue edges toward treason. Speak another word of rebellion, and I will put a bolt through your skull myself." She turned her eyes to Curian, sharp and demanding. "You see what your silence has bred, General. Doubt spreads like rot. You must name the Emperor, bind them in his memory, or you will lose this fortress not to the enemy, but to mutiny." Myros's voice rose, a snarl against her steel. "Mutiny is born not of truth, but of lies. Every man here knows the Imperium has abandoned us. You cling to his name because it is all you have left, but loyalty to ashes will not hold these walls." He stepped closer to Curian, his eyes burning. "Choose, General. Choose now, or they will choose for you." The three stood in the narrow corridor, the storm's howl seeping through cracks in the stone, the air heavy with the weight of decision. Curian's heart pounded like a war drum, his throat tight with words that refused to form. In that moment, he felt the fracture within himself laid bare. Myros's plea echoed his own hidden truth. Elira's fury reflected the chains still shackled to his soul, and around them the silence of the fortress waited, a silence that would soon be shattered. Later that night, the silence did shatter. A sentry raised the alarm. Movement at the eastern wall. Not enemy, but within their own ranks. Curian rushed to the battlements with Myros and Elira at his side, the snow whipping around them in ghostly veils. There, in the dim torchlight, he saw it. A group of soldiers gathered at the gatehouse, their weapons raised not against the enemy, but against each other. Their voices clashed, some demanding the gates be abandoned, that they flee into the tundra rather than die for nothing. Others shouted for discipline, for the Emperor's name, for obedience even unto death. The standoff teetered on the edge of bloodshed. Then a shot rang out, sudden and sharp. One man fell, his blood steaming in the snow. Panic surged, shouts turned to screams, rifles raised, the crack of lass fire split the storm. Curian moved without thought, stepping into the chaos, his sword drawn. His voice cut through the noise, deeper than thunder. "Enough!" The word struck the air like a hammer. For a moment, the fighting paused, eyes turning to him. He saw terror, fury, despair, all burning in the faces of men who no longer knew who they were fighting for. Elira's pistol was already raised, her face taut with righteous wrath. "They are traitors," she shouted. "Purge them before doubt spreads." Her finger tightened on the trigger. At the same time, Myros stepped forward, his arms outstretched, his voice raw. No, they are Valhallans. They fight for their lives, for their families. Don't murder them for refusing to kneel to a throne that cannot hear them. His eyes met Curian's, desperate. General, give the word. Bind them to truth, not to fear. Curian stood between them, the storm howling around him, the fortress groaning under distant bombardment. The men waited, breathless, their weapons half raised, their souls poised between loyalty and rebellion. His silence could no longer hold them. He felt the weight of his choice pressing down, heavier than any chain, sharper than any blade. The words that came from his mouth were low, but they cut deeper than the wind. We fight for Valhalla. The courtyard fell into stillness, as though the storm itself had hushed to hear him. Myros's eyes widened with relief, his shoulders sagging with the release of long-held truth. Elira froze, her lips parting, fury and disbelief flashing across her face. The soldiers stared at him, their breath visible in the cold air, their hearts caught in the moment between despair and defiance. Curian lifted his sword, its edge catching the torchlight. Not for the Emperor, not for his throne, for the land beneath our boots, for the graves of our fathers, for the blood we shed together. Valhalla does not kneel. Valhalla does not break. His voice rose, carrying across the courtyard, echoing against the stone. We fight, not because we are remembered, but because we will not be erased. The silence broke into a roar. Soldiers raised their rifles, voices rising in ragged cries of Valhalla. The sound surged through the fortress, carrying into every corridor, into the hearts of the wounded, into the hands of those who still clutched their weapons. The cry became a storm of its own, defiance made flesh. Myros's face lit with grim pride. Elira's eyes narrowed, her hand trembling, at her pistol, but she did not fire. Not yet. The moment passed into chaos as the alarm bells tolled again. The enemy was moving, their engines grinding, their torches burning closer. But the fortress no longer echoed with silence. It echoed with defiance, with the voice of men who had chosen their truth. Curian lowered his sword, his chest heaving, his heart both lighter and heavier than before. He had broken the chain. He had named Valhalla above the Emperor, and in that choice, he knew the battle within him had been decided, even if the war without could not be won. Beyond the flames, the enemy roared into the night, and Valhalla roared back. The roar of Valhalla's name had barely faded before the storm of steel descended again. The enemy struck with a fury greater than before, their war machines grinding across the blackened snow, their engines shaking the ground beneath the fortress. The night sky lit with artillery fire, flashes of crimson and gold tearing through the clouds, turning the storm into a canvas of fire. The walls shook under bombardment, cracks splitting the stone, dust raining into the corridors below. Men stumbled but did not flee, their voices still echoing with the word they had chosen, a word heavier than any oath: Valhalla. Curian stood at the southern wall, sword in hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon where fire bled into the snow. He had broken his silence, and the echo of his words still clung to him. They no longer fought for a distant emperor. They fought for the land itself, for the soil beneath their boots, for the graves of their fathers. The weight of that truth settled upon his shoulders, heavier even than command, but it also burned with a clarity sharper than ice. He felt the men around him look to him not as a mouthpiece of the Imperium, but as the last shield of Valhalla. The first shells crashed against the battlements, exploding into showers of stone and flame. Men screamed, torn apart by shrapnel, their cries swallowed by the storm. Curian barked orders, his voice steady above the chaos. Hold your fire until they breach the line. make every shot count. His words steadied trembling hands, calmed the panic that threatened to spread. Myros moved through the trench, rallying men with shouts and oaths, dragging the wounded to cover with a strength that seemed inexhaustible. Elira patrolled like a shadow, her pistol raised, her eyes sharp, her presence a reminder that though they fought for Valhalla, the chains of discipline had not been cast aside entirely. The enemy struck in waves, their silhouettes dark against the firelight, endless ranks pressing forward through the storm. Lasfire seared into the night. Bolters roared, mortars shook the earth. The air filled with the stench of ozone and blood. The snow turned to black mud beneath the weight of bodies. For every enemy slain, another advanced, relentless, silent, a tide that seemed never-ending. Curian cut through the chaos, his sword flashing in, arcs of crimson light, his voice a constant anchor. At the height of the assault, the northern wall faltered. A section crumbled under the bombardment, stones cascading into the snow. Enemy war machines pushed through the breach, their cannons spitting fire into the courtyard. Soldiers scrambled to hold the gap, but panic flared as the enemy surged. Curian rushed toward the collapse, his cloak whipping in the storm, Myros at his side. Together they led a charge into the breach, rallying the defenders, their cries of Valhalla shattering the fear. The clash became hand to hand, steel against steel, blood soaking into snow. Curian struck down an armored foe, his sword biting through metal, his arms trembling with exertion but unyielding. In the midst of the melee, he saw a boy no older than 16, his rifle broken, a bayonet pressed against his throat by an enemy soldier. Without thought, Curian lunged, cutting the attacker down. He pulled the boy to his feet, shoving a weapon into his hands. "Stand," he commanded, his voice raw. The boy's eyes widened, terror giving way to something fiercer, and he nodded, taking his place again in the line. Moments like that became countless. Every second, another soul torn between despair and defiance. Every heartbeat a choice. The battle raged until the ground itself seemed to howl. Fires burned along the walls, smoke choking the air, screams mingling with the thunder of cannons. Curian's sword grew heavy in his hand, his breath ragged, blood, his and others, soaking his coat. But the line held, not for the Emperor, not for orders, but for Valhalla. Each cry of defiance rose like a storm, carrying through the night, shaking even the enemy with its ferocity. Yet not all were bound to that oath. As the fighting waned for a brief moment, Curian received word of signals sent from within the fortress. Scouts intercepted transmissions carried through the storm, their origins traced not to the enemy beyond the walls, but from inside. Betrayal. His chest tightened as the report was thrust into his hands, proof that someone within the fortress had sought to summon the enemy deeper, to weaken their defense from inside. He thought of Myros, of Elira, of the colonel of the northern remnants, of desperate men in the barracks who still clung to the Emperor's name. Doubt pressed against him like ice. That night, after the battle's fury dimmed to embers, the fortress groaned with exhaustion. The wounded filled the infirmary, their moans echoing through the stone corridors. Lyra moved among them, her hands red, her eyes hollow, her voice soft as she whispered comfort none believed. She looked up when Curian entered, her face pale, her lips trembling with words she did not want to speak. "They cannot hold much longer," she whispered. "Their bodies break faster than your orders can bind them. If you cannot save them, then save their dignity." Her eyes searched his, demanding an answer he could not. "Shang, give." He touched her cheek with blood-stained fingers, but no words came. His silence was all that remained. In the officer's chamber, Myros slammed his fist against the table. There is betrayal among us. Find them, drag them into the snow, and let their blood freeze in front of the men. Only then will they know who leads them. His voice shook with fury, with desperation sharpened into violence. Elira's eyes gleamed cold in the torchlight, her lips curling. Perhaps the traitor is not hidden, she said, her words slow, cutting. Perhaps it is the man who turned his tongue against the emperor. Perhaps it is you, Sergeant. Or perhaps... Her gaze shifted to Curian, sharp as a knife. The general himself. The chamber froze. Myros bristled, his hand tightening on his rifle. Say that again, and you will not leave this room alive. Elira's pistol was already drawn, its black muzzle steady. Loyalty does not waver. Betrayal hides in silence and defiance both. Curian raised his hand, his voice low but commanding. Enough. His eyes burned into both of them, heavy with exhaustion but unflinching. The traitor will be found. But this war is not fought in whispers. It is fought on the walls. Tomorrow we face them again. If we die, it will be on the battlements, not in shadows. The storm outside howled as though in answer. Beyond the smouldering fires, the enemy gathered once more, their glow eternal, their march unending. Inside the fortress, whispers of betrayal spread like frost, creeping into every corner. Curian stood alone in the courtyard, his sword in hand, staring into the horizon. The flames of the battlefield still burned in his eyes, but now shadows lingered too. The enemy was at the gates, but the true collapse, he knew, would come from within. Snow fell lightly then, soft flakes drifting through smoke and ash, settling upon blood-stained stone. For a moment, the world was still. And in that stillness, Curian felt the truth settle upon him like the weight of the sky. Valhalla would not be broken by the enemy's fire alone. It would be broken by the choices made in silence, by the betrayals whispered in the dark, by the fractures that could no longer be mended. The bells tolled again, low and mournful, and the night shivered with their sound. The storm of fire would come with the dawn. The dawn came grey and hollow, the kind of light that brought no warmth, only the pale revelation of ruin. Smoke coiled above the fortress, rising in thin streams from shattered walls and smouldering barricades. Snow fell in soft sheets, muffling the moans of the wounded and the shuffle of exhausted soldiers dragging themselves into position. The bells had ceased tolling, yet their echo seemed to linger in the marrow of every man and woman who still lived. They knew another assault loomed, and they knew the fortress was cracking, not just from the bombardments, but from within. Curian stood in the courtyard, his cloak stiff with blood and frost. Around him, squads staggered into order, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They looked not to the horizon now, but to him. The weight of their gaze pressed against his chest, heavier than any armor. He had spoken for Valhalla, and in doing so, he had severed the chain to the emperor. The soldiers clung to that word, to the defiance of a doomed people. Yet beneath it all, whispers of betrayal slithered still. Signals had been sent. Someone had invited the enemy deeper. The walls themselves groaned with suspicion. Myros approached, his broad shoulders hunched beneath the storm. His face was smeared with ash, his eyes bloodshot, but his voice carried the same fire it always had. "We must root out the traitor before nightfall," he muttered. "If the men believe betrayal festers among us, they will break. Let me lead a sweep. I'll drag the truth into the open, and when I find them, I'll make the execution public. Fear will turn to fury, and fury will bind them." His hand trembled as he gripped his rifle. "We cannot afford shadows, General. Not now. Before Curian could respond, Elara stepped from the smoke, her coat snapping like a banner in the wind. Her pistol gleamed at her side, ready as always. "The traitor is already known," she said coldly. "It is any man who lifts his tongue against the Emperor. It is any soldier who whispers Valhalla's name above his. Discipline has frayed under your silence, General, and rot has crept in. If you do not name loyalty, I will." Her gaze cut to Myros with unflinching contempt. "The sergeant preaches rebellion. Strike him down, and you strike the treachery at its root." Myros stepped forward, his face burning with rage. "You dare!" But Curian raised a hand, silencing them both. His voice was low, heavy as stone. "Enough. The enemy presses even now. We have no time to turn upon ourselves. When their fire falls again, every rifle must be aimed outward, not inward." His words carried command, but beneath them, doubt gnawed. He had not chosen between them, only postponed the inevitable. The storm outside deepened. Scouts reported enemy engines moving, their glow flickering closer through the blizzard. The soldiers prepared in silence, tightening bandages, loading rifles, whispering last words to gods that no longer listened. The infirmary overflowed, blood freezing on the stone floor. Lara moving from bed to bed, with hands cracked and raw. She looked at her father when he entered, her eyes sharp with exhaustion and fury. "You speak of Valhalla, but you give them no end. They die without knowing what their sacrifice means. Do you lead them to live or only to burn?" Her words struck harder than the shells that shattered the walls. He had no answer, only silence, and she turned from him, her shoulders trembling beneath the weight of the dying. The bombardment began before noon. The sky split with fire, shells screaming down, exploding into towers of smoke and flame. The walls cracked, sections crumbling into ruin, snow and stone collapsing into blackened heaps. The air filled with dust and ash, choking lungs, blinding eyes. The soldiers clung to their rifles, coughing, shouting, their voices swallowed by thunder. Curian moved among them, dragging men to their feet, shouting orders that were half lost in the storm. Myros fired from the barricades, his voice raw, bellowing Valhalla's name. Elara executed a man who tried to flee. Her pistol shot sharp against the chaos. Their clash of philosophies played out not in words now, but in the fire of their actions. The eastern gate collapsed under the bombardment, a gaping wound in the fortress wall. Through it surged the enemy, armored figures advancing through smoke, their weapons spitting fire. The Valhallans met them with a fury born of desperation. Rifles cracked, blades flashed, men screamed as they clashed in the ruins of their own gatehouse. Curian threw himself into the melee, his sword carving arcs of steel, his breath ragged, his voice thundering over the storm. "Stand for Valhalla!" The cry spread through the ranks, ragged but fierce. Men who moments before had trembled now surged forward, bayonets gleaming, their defiance shaking even the enemy's unbroken march. The fighting turned savage, hand against hand, blade against blade, blood soaking into the snow until it was no longer white but crimson. For hours the battle raged, neither side yielding, the fortress trembling beneath their fury. As dusk fell, the enemy withdrew, dragging their dead through the breach, their engines fading back into the storm. The Valhallans had held, but the cost was staggering. Bodies littered the courtyard, stacked in heaps against shattered walls. The air reeked of blood, smoke, and despair. The survivors slumped against barricades, their faces grey with exhaustion, their eyes empty. Myros leaned against a wall, his chest heaving, his face streaked with grime. "We held," he said, almost in disbelief. We held, General. Elira stood nearby, her pistol still smoking, her eyes cold. We held for now, but tomorrow they come again, and the next day, and the next. This fortress will not survive the weak. Discipline is all that will carry us into the grave with dignity. Her gaze locked on Curian, hard and accusing. But you have chosen defiance over obedience. Remember this when the walls fall. Curian said nothing. He walked among the bodies, his boots crunching on frozen blood, his heart heavy with every face he recognized. He stopped when he saw the boy he had saved days before, the one he had commanded to stand. The boy lay among the dead, his rifle still clutched in stiff fingers, his eyes open to the storm. Curian knelt, closing them with his hand. For a moment, the world seemed to collapse into silence, broken only by the whisper of snow falling upon the dead. That night, the fortress was quiet. Fires burned low, shadows stretching long across the ruined walls. In the command chamber, the officers gathered, their faces hollow, their voices hushed. Myros demanded they rally for Valhalla again, that they burn with pride, even in defeat. Elira demanded executions to cleanse treachery before it spread further. Curian sat at the head of the table, silent, his hands heavy against the stone. Both voices tore at him, but neither could silence the truth now lodged in his heart. Valhalla would fall. Whether by the enemy's fire or by betrayal within, the end was certain. All that remained was how they would face it, as ghosts chained to a throne that had abandoned them, or as warriors who had chosen their own death. Snow drifted through the shattered windows, flakes settling on the table between them. Curian looked at them, Mgiros with his burning loyalty to land, Elira with her cold devotion to empire, and knew the time for silence was almost gone. The storm pressed closer, engines grinding in the distance, fire glowing against the horizon. He whispered to himself, so faint no one heard. The end is coming, and when it comes, it will know our name. The dawn broke with fire, not light. The eastern horizon glowed red, and soon the storm split apart under the howl of engines and the thunder of guns. The fortress trembled before the first shells even struck, dust falling from cracked ceilings, stones loosening from shattered walls. The Valhallans, half-starved and half-mad from sleepless nights, clutched their rifles as though the steel alone could keep the world from collapsing. There was no song, no prayer, no whisper of the Emperor's name, only the steady breath of men and women who knew they stood at the edge of the final night. Curian walked the inner barricades, his sword sheathed at his side, his cloak torn and stiff with blood. He passed rows of hollow-eyed soldiers crouched behind sandbags and barrels, some clutching charms carved from ice, others staring at the snow as though they saw the graves already waiting for them. They looked to him, and their gazes burned with something beyond loyalty. It was ownership. They had given him their deaths, and he carried them like stones in his chest. He paused beside a mortar crew, their hands trembling as they adjusted the cracked barrel. "Wait for my signal," he told them. His voice was low, but it steadied their hands. Myros stood near the northern wall, rallying squads with a voice raw from shouting. "Valhalla!" he cried, raising his rifle high, and the word echoed raggedly across the barricades. Some cheered, some whispered it like a curse, but all repeated it. He moved through the lines with fire in his eyes, binding men with the promise that they did not die forgotten, that the snow itself would remember. Elira patrolled the rear, her coat dark as shadow, her pistol ready at her hip. She did not shout, she did not rouse. She watched, and when one soldier faltered, whispering of escape, she put a bolt through his skull. The crack echoed against the stone, silencing the whispers of desertion. Her eyes flicked toward Curian after the shot, sharp as knives, as though daring him to call her cruelty anything but discipline. The first wave came like a tide. War machines rolled into view, vast shapes of iron bristling with guns, their engines churning through the snow. Behind them marched endless lines of soldiers, armored silhouettes carrying torches that turned the storm into a sea of fire. The earth shook with their march, and the fortress walls groaned like a dying beast. Curian raised his sword, the gesture slow but unyielding, and the Valhallans opened fire. The trenches blazed red, mortars thundered, shells arcing into the enemy lines, explosions ripping through the snow and tearing bodies into ash. Lasfire lit the storm, bolts searing through armor, cutting down the first ranks. The roar of the fortress became a wall of noise, a scream of defiance hurled into the maw of inevitability. Men shouted Valhalla's name as they fired, voices cracking, but each cry a refusal to kneel. The enemy pressed on. Their machines returned fire, cannons hammering into barricades, stone and flesh exploding together. Sections of wall crumbled, sending defenders tumbling into the ruins. Curian strode through the chaos, his sword raised, pulling men to their feet, forcing them back into the fight. He cut down an enemy soldier who vaulted the barricade, the blade biting deep, and the men around him surged forward with renewed fury. "Stand," he thundered, and they obeyed, though every step left blood behind. The eastern barricade collapsed under the weight of machines. The enemy surged through the breach, their torches blazing. Curian led a countercharge, Myros at his side, the two of them crashing into the enemy line with steel and fire. The clash was a blur of screams and blood, bayonets stabbing, swords cleaving. Myros fought like a man possessed, his rifle a club in his hands, his voice still carrying Valhalla's cry, even as his body bled from a dozen cuts. They pushed the enemy back for moments, just long enough for the barricade to be reinforced with burning wreckage and the dead. But the fortress bled with them. In the infirmary, Lyra moved through the wounded, her hands slick with blood, her face pale. The walls shook with every bombardment, dust raining onto the cots. She pressed cloth into wounds that could not be closed, whispered comfort into ears that could no longer hear. Her gaze flicked often to the door, as though expecting her father to appear at any moment. But he never came. Only more bodies did, carried on stretchers, their eyes wide and unseeing. By midday, the courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Fires burned unchecked, smoke choking the air, mingling with the stink of blood and charred flesh. The snow was gone, replaced by black slush and crimson pools. The enemy pressed closer, wave after wave, never pausing, never faltering. For every one that fell, another came. The Valhallans fought until their rifles overheated, until their blades dulled, until their arms could no longer lift. And still they stood, screaming Valhalla's name into the storm. In the command chamber, arguments flared, even as the walls shook. Myros demanded they rally again at the central keep, turn the last stronghold into a tomb of fire. "Let them choke on our bones," he snarled. "Let the ashes of Valhalla burn into their throats." Elira demanded executions, insisting that deserters and doubters were spreading rot faster than shells could kill. "Discipline will outlast flesh," she hissed. "Fear will keep their hands steady." Their voices clashed like steel, the chamber trembling with their fury. Curian sat in silence, his eyes hollow, his hands heavy upon the table. He listened to both, their words battering him like waves against stone. Myros's fire, Elira's ice. Both demanded a choice, and his silence had already chosen too much. At last, he rose, his cloak falling heavy across his shoulders. "Enough," he said, his voice flat, tired. "Tomorrow does not wait for our quarrels. Prepare the keep. Burn the dead. We will make our last stand there." The officers fell silent, the truth of his words undeniable. Valhalla would not endure another day. Their war had become not survival, but memory. That night, the fortress was a grave. Fires flickered in broken windows. Shadows stretched long across walls that would soon crumble. Soldiers huddled together, whispering not prayers but farewells. Some carved their names into the stone, others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Miros stood among them, his voice softer now, speaking of the land, of ancestors who had endured winters longer than empires, who had stood when the universe itself forgot them. His words were not speeches, but reminders, quiet truths clung to in the dark. Elira walked the halls, pistol at her side, her eyes sharp, watching, listening. She said nothing, but her gaze carried a threat sharper than words. Few dared to meet it. Fewer dared to speak near her. Corian climbed the battlements, alone. The storm had thinned, stars glimmering faintly beyond clouds. Below, the snowfields still smouldered from fires, and in the distance the enemy's glow pulsed eternal, closer now than ever. He gripped the frozen stone, his breath heavy, his heart burning with exhaustion. He thought of his daughter, her hands red with blood. He thought of Miros shouting Valhalla's name until his throat tore. He thought of Elira, her pistol cold and merciless. He thought of the men who had given him their deaths, and the chain he had broken with a single word. He whispered into the night, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "When the end comes, let it be ours, not theirs." The horizon glowed brighter in answer, and the storm carried the sound of engines through the dark. The final march had begun. They came before the sun could rise. A wall of fire. On the horizon, engines screaming through the frozen dark, torches flaring like 1,000 red stars descending. The final assault had begun. The sky was ash, the ground bone. Valhalla's last night was over. Within the keep, the air was thick with smoke and prayers that tasted of blood. Soldiers lined the inner halls, some too young to shave, others too old to stand straight. There were no more tactics to discuss, no lines to redraw. The last stand was no longer an order. It was the only option left. Corian walked through the corridors in silence, the battered remnants of his command parting around him like shadows. He wore no ceremonial armor now, only a cloak burnt at the hem, a breastplate dented and scorched, and the sword that had never left his side. There was no one left to impress, only ghosts. He passed a wall where names had been carved with knives, bullets, fingertips. No ranks, no medals, only names etched into stone with the desperation of those who refused to vanish. He paused, running a gloved hand across the newest ones, the frost clinging to the cuts like a final blessing. In the courtyard, Miros gathered a group of stragglers, those still able to stand, to hold rifles or blades. His coat was soaked through, and his voice was hoarse. But when he saw Corian, he straightened, lifted his chin. "They're coming fast," he said. "Machines, infantry, everything. They'll break through in an hour, maybe less. This is all we've got." Corian looked at the faces, dirty, bloodied, half-starved. Some had no boots, some no fingers. All of them stared back at him with the quiet defiance of men who had already made peace with death. "We're not enough," Miros said softly, "but we're still here." Elira stood at the steps above them, her coat dark with soot, the executioner to the end. She had said nothing all morning, her silence more dangerous than ever. When Curian met her gaze, she did not blink. Whatever loyalty remained between them now existed only in the distance neither had crossed. They took their positions in the rubble of the keep, behind walls that barely stood, within corridors lit by shattered lanterns. They waited, and the silence grew thick, punctuated only by the coughs of the dying. The click of rifles checked one last time. Lyra moved between them, a satchel of bandages slung across her shoulder. Her hands were numb, her sleeves soaked, her face unreadable. She didn't speak to her father when she passed him, only nodded. He hadn't earned words, not anymore. The first shell tore through the eastern side, sending stone and fire in all directions. Screams followed, short and sharp, then silence again, then more shells. Dozens, hundreds. The air collapsed under the weight of explosions. The keep shook. Windows shattered. Ceilings cracked. Then the machines came. Massive armored things crawling across corpses, bristling with fire. Behind them came the infantry, rows of black-armored figures, unhurried, precise, death in formation. Curian stood at the base of the ruined stairwell and raised his sword. Now, the final defense began like a spark catching in dry snow. Rifles cracked, bolters thundered, Molotovs flew. Men shouted not out of courage, but because the silence had become unbearable. The enemy surged into the halls, through corridors barely wide enough for their weapons. The fighting was hand to hand, room to room. Blood painted the walls. Screams echoed up staircases like the voices of the dead, returning for one final cry. Curian fought at the center of it, blade flashing in narrow arcs, the weight of every command, every silence, every lie ringing through his wrists with each strike. He did not speak. He did not shout orders. He simply killed, and killed again. Myros fell beside him, a wound torn through his abdomen, steam rising from his armor. "Don't let it end quiet," he gasped, blood foaming at his lips. Curian knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "It won't." Elira fought on the second floor, holding the eastern hall with 5 men. When the breach collapsed, she stood alone at the top of the stairwell and emptied her pistol into the oncoming wave. When the last round clicked, she drew her blade and walked down the stairs into the fire. Lyra was found in the chapel, surrounded by wounded. She had refused to flee. When the wall broke and the enemy poured in, she stood between them and the cots with only a scalpel in her hand. They shot her last. The keep was lost before the sun reached its peak. Fires roared through the walls, black smoke curling into the sky. The enemy pulled back briefly, the fortress now nothing but a broken tomb. Only Curian remained, deep within the central hall, alone. He could no longer hear the battle, only the crackle of flames, the groan of stone. He stood before the great banner of Valhalla, half burnt, its fabric curled at the edges. He took it down, holding it in one arm, sword in the other. When the enemy breached the final door, they found him waiting. He did not kneel. He did not surrender. The last Valhallans stood tall beneath the smouldering rafters, and when they raised their weapons, he stepped forward into the light and gave them everything. The wind outside howled through the ruins. Snow began to fall once more, covering the blood, the ash, the broken stones. And far away, where no enemy ever marched, a wind carried the name of a dead world across the stars. Valhalla. They found him in the ashes. His body lay at the foot of the broken banner pole, his sword buried in the chest of the last soldier he had killed, his other hand still clenched in a fist. The banner of Valhalla, scorched and torn, was wrapped around his shoulders like a shroud. Snow had begun to settle across his face. gentle as breath, as if the storm itself mourned what it had taken. Around him, the keep was silent. There were no more voices, no more cries of defiance, no more clash of steel, only the cold and the slow drift of white over the ruin. The enemy moved through the remains of the fortress with measured caution. They had expected some resistance, a final ambush, perhaps traps laid among the rubble, but there was nothing, only the dead. In the infirmary, they stepped over bodies still clinging to bandages and tools. In the chapel, they found a girl with red-streaked sleeves lying in a pool of frozen blood. In the stairwells, they passed the scorched husks of soldiers who had refused to retreat, their rifles melted into their hands. Every room whispered the same story. They had all chosen to die here. Not one had run. Word passed slowly from squad to squad. The defenders had not surrendered. There had been no white flag, no signal, no plea for mercy. Even as the walls burned, they had stood. Even as the keep collapsed, they had held. And at the center of it all was the body of the general, who had made no final speech, no last broadcast. Only that silent, impossible act of standing until he could stand no more. A silence spread among the invaders. Not out of reverence, there was no place for reverence in war, but something colder, something stranger. The kind of silence that comes when all resistance should be gone, but something still lingers in the air. A weight that had nothing to do with tactics or victories. They moved carefully now, their boots leaving no prints in the snow, their voices low, as though the dead still listened. The report was sent back to command. Valhalla is taken. No survivors. Minimal resistance in final hours. Facility structurally unsound. All objectives secured. Additional note. Defenders chose annihilation. No attempt to surrender. That was all it said. No mention of the boy whose name was carved into the wall with bloodied fingertips. No mention of the old man who'd held the stairwell alone until the barrels ran dry. No mention of the woman with frost-bitten hands who'd stitched wounds in a burning infirmary. And no mention of the man who'd broken his chains with silence and spoken a name louder than any order ever could. They left the bodies where they fell. There were too many to bury. The machines moved through the rubble, scanning for signals, salvaging what they could. Memory cores, fuel cells, weapon fragments. But something about the fortress resisted even now. Electronics flickered out when brought near the chapel. Vox units crackled with static near the carved walls. At the center, where Curian had died, the snow never melted, not even when they brought flame units to the hall. Eventually, they stopped sending squads inside. A week later, the storm returned. A true Valhallan storm. The kind that buried cities, that cracked engines in half, that howled with voices long forgotten. The enemy pulled back, leaving the outer walls exposed, convinced there was nothing left to reclaim. They were right, and yet something remained. In the years that followed, Valhalla was marked as a dead world. The Imperium, having received no distress signal, declared it lost with honors. No reinforcements were ever dispatched. No memorials were raised. It vanished from the registers like dust swept from a table. But across the stars, in places where soldiers whispered to each other between battles, Valhalla's name lived. No one knew where the stories began. A platoon on Cardia said a voice came through the Vox the night before they were overrun. A voice that simply said, "Hold." A transport crew swore they saw shapes in the ice fields of a dead moon. Shapes standing still with rifles in their hands, unmoving, unmelting. A medici on Armageddon claimed a dying soldier asked if this was Valhalla. then smiled before his heart stopped. The Inquisition labeled such accounts as atmospheric delusions, stress-induced hallucinations. Files were closed. The name was flagged for redaction. But even among the Astartes, even among the Mechanicus, the whisper remained. Valhalla, a word spoken not in hope, but in defiance. A word carved into the edge of annihilation. In time, new wars consumed the galaxy. New heroes rose and fell. Planets were won, then lost, then won again. Entire sectors were swallowed by the warp. Monuments crumbled, systems blinked out of existence. But Valhalla was not forgotten, not in the way memory fades, but in the way ice remembers pressure long after the weight is gone. And somewhere, beneath layers of snow and silence, the stone still stands. The names are still carved. The blood has faded, but the echoes remain. In the dead heart of a ruined fortress, a single sword lies buried in the chest of a nameless foe. A banner, blackened and torn, rests across the stone like a final breath. And in the wind, if one stands very still and listens with a heart that still knows loyalty, a voice can sometimes be heard. A whisper that comes through snow and silence and time itself. We did not kneel. We did not surrender. We were Valhallans, and we were never forgotten. The years passed like ghosts through an abandoned hall, brushing against the remains of what had once burned bright with purpose. The stars wheeled overhead in silence, blind to the memory of the frozen rock they circled, and yet Valhalla endured, not in stone or signal, not in code or charted registry, but in the marrow of those who had heard its name whispered when all else was lost. Entire generations rose and fell without hearing of it, but in certain corners of the Imperium, where war was more constant than breath, the name still stirred something in the blood. Some called it a myth, others a curse. A few called it a promise. On a void-battered cruiser in the Segmentum Obscurus, a commissar found the word scratched beneath a bunk, Valhalla, scored into the steel with a mess kit knife. No one in the regiment claimed to have done it. They were from Talon. They had never fought in the snow. And yet, that night, when the fleet's Vox arrays failed during a sudden warp storm and the decks filled with a shrieking that had no mouth behind it, every man in that bay stood with their weapons drawn, shoulder to shoulder, unmoving until silence returned. In the morning, the knife was gone. In its place, a torn scrap of black cloth, half burned at the edge, with a white stripe down its center. Far from there, on the edge of a dying world in the ghoul stars, an Explorator Mechanicus team uncovered a frozen ruin buried beneath the ice shelf of a long dead sea. The machines refused to scan it. Every attempt to transmit was met with shrieking feedback and lines of corrupted data that translated only into the phrase, "He still stands." When the tech priest ordered a servitor inside, the unit simply stopped moving, its lenses filled with frost. No signal returned. The next day, the ruin was gone, swallowed by ice as if the planet itself had closed its mouth. In the hallowed silence of Titan, among the grey-armoured knights who feared neither death nor demons, a single veteran spoke of a dream he could not shake, a cold keep, a burning sky, a man with no face standing at the end of a ruined hall, surrounded by bodies and snow and silence. He said the man spoke no words, and yet his voice filled the entire dream, louder than any chant. He awoke with a scar across his palm, one that had not been there the night before, shaped like a blade's edge. He said nothing after that, not even to the librarians who probed his mind for corruption. He simply stood watch at the gate for days on end, unmoving, waiting for something no one else could name. There were others. A scout who claimed a white shape, followed her through the ashen wastes of Dravok Secundus, always just at the edge of her auspex. A chapel servitor who wept real tears while cleaning the altar of the emperor. A child born during the siege of Solace who refused to cry, but instead held her hands out as if holding a rifle, fists clenched tight even in sleep. And a deserter, caught and sentenced to summary execution, who whispered, "Valhalla," just before the bolt round took him, his voice carrying further than it should have, echoing down the corridors of the penal ship long after his body slumped. These moments did not form a pattern, not on any tactical grid, not in the archives of the Munitorum, but somewhere deeper, in the cracked bones of the galaxy, in the inkless script of sacrifice, they formed a story, not one written by the living, but by the dead who refuse to fade. The kind of story that lingers not in records, but in the marrow of silence, in the pause before the charge, in the stillness between heartbeats when a soldier chooses to stand. And so, though Valhalla was never reclaimed, and no beacon ever rose from its ruined halls, the memory moved like frost in the lungs of those who needed it most. In the moment before fear turned men to cowards, it became a word they could hold. In the instant before surrender, it was the cold breath that hardened the spine. They did not need to know where it had been, only that it had been. That once a fortress had stood in the mouth of the storm and said no, and that was enough. Back on Valhalla, the wind still howled. It carried no signal, no message, but it curled around the jagged stones like fingers remembering the shape of a grip. It stirred the ash that coated the chapel's shattered threshold. It pressed against the warped blast doors, now frozen shut by time and silence. And deep within, beneath a collapsed archway, something still flickered. Not light, not heat. Something colder, older. A memory that refused to die. The sword still lay where it had fallen, buried to the hilt in the corpse of the last invader. Around it, frost had formed in perfect lines, like veins or cracks in old glass. The hilt, blackened and scorched, still bore the emblem of the Fourth Company, barely visible beneath the soot, and behind it, beneath a layer of snow that never melted, the body of General Curian Val sat slumped against the wall, his face long turned to bone, but his posture unchanged. One hand rested on his knee, the other on his chest, just above the shattered vox bead. Outside, the sky turned violet with the dying sun. The storm was returning. The air thickened with the scent of ozone and snow. Far above, a satellite passed in silence, its sensors long dead, its purpose forgotten. And yet, for a moment, it caught something, an anomaly, brief and inexplicable, a single pulse deep beneath the ice. Not a signal, not a call for help, just presence. And then it was gone. But it was enough. Somewhere, a guardsman lifted his head at the front. Somewhere, a sister of battle paused mid-prayer. Somewhere, a servitor looked up at a ruined sky and froze in place. Somewhere, a child reached out in her sleep and whispered a word she had never been taught. Valhalla, not gone, just waiting.